In the last video, I examined the development of the cultural landscape of Great Britain by its initial Celtic founders, its conquest by the Romans, its infiltration by the Anglo-Saxons, and the slow but sure creation of what can be called modern-day England by a successive series of wars against Viking colonizers. Alfred the Great of Wessex had started the process of English unification, and his descendants continued this policy, eventually pacifying the country into a relative state of stability and peace with its Celtic neighbors. However, with the murder of Edward the Martyr in 978 through a possible political conspiracy, the beginning of the end for the House of Wessex, as well as an autonomous Anglo-Saxon ruled Kingdom of England, was set in motion by the ascension of King Ethelred. Ethelred was only 12 when he ascended to the throne of the English, another young English king. Despite the circumstances by which this ascension occurred, with his mother's possible connection to his half-brother's murder, he was celebrated due to his attractive face and handsome appearance. Bishop Ethelwold, who previously supported his claim to the throne, was one of his earliest advisors. In 985, Ethelred married Aethelgu, a daughter of the Earl of Northumbria, producing 4 sons, Ithelstan, Edmund, Edred, and Edvig. The production of healthy sons was a good thing for his dynasty, but the 880s brought forth the resurfacing of old problems. After a few decades of relative peace with the Danes, raids began occurring again all over the English coast. By the early 990s, these raids were turning into full-scale invasions as they had before, with the Danes winning a decisive battle at Maldon and Essex. Ethelred was not nearly as military ambitious as some of his ancestors, so he pursued a policy of appeasement. He decided to pay off the Danish raiders to stop harassing England, about 10,000 pounds. Olaf, the leader of the raids, was confirmed as a converted Christian in a ceremony with Ethelred present, and promised to never come back to England again. However, not surprisingly, the Danes returned to pillaging in 997. After years of continued raids in southwestern England, only for the Danes to return to their base on the Isle of Wight whenever they were pursued, Ethelred, humiliated again, paid off the Danes to stop the assault with 24,000 pounds. In 1002, Ethelred's wife Ylfgivu died, and he decided to remarry immediately Emma of Normandy, the sister of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, the first time an English monarch had married outside of the Anglo-Saxon world. This was a deliberate attempt at establishing an alliance, as England was in a constant feud with Normandy in the latter half of the 10th century. The Duchy of Normandy was born in 911 from a Viking incursion into northern France as a de jure fief of the Kingdom of France, but was de facto independent. Because of Normandy's Viking founding, they often helped the Danes in their raids into England, but now Richard II was hoping to establish peace with Ethelred, as England was considering invading their duchy, so he offered his sister up to Ethelred. This established good relations between the two realms across the English Channel. Emma of Normandy quickly bore Ethelred 2 more sons, Edward and Alfred. After paying tribute to the Danes for a second time, King Ethelred must have felt quite humiliated and frustrated at the Scandinavian problem that had been affecting his country ever since it was founded. In a fit of rage, he ordered the death of all Danish men in England on November 13th of 1002, St. Brice's Day. One of the victims of the horrific massacre, Gunhilda, was the sister of Sven Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. This cruel and drastic measure of Ethelred's would only provoke a sleeping giant. In vengeance, Sven invaded East Anglia in 1004. This attempt at regaining Danish land in England was unsuccessful, but the king of Denmark was not done with his greater schemes for Great Britain. Ethelred continued to pay off more money to the Danes any time they appeared near their shore, perhaps fearful of the rage Denmark was about to enact on the country. This severely weakened the treasure of England, and thus the entire military and defense of the nation collapsed between 1009 and 1012. It would be an understatement to say that Ethelred was severely mismanaging his kingdom. With all the tribute funds that England had given him, Sven was able to launch a full-scale invasion of England in 1013, where he officially proclaimed himself as the rightful king of England, appealing to the history of Danish influence in England back into the 9th century. He knew he would be received warmly in the north of England, which still owed a lot more to Scandinavia than to Wessex. Due to its complete lack of defense, England fell quickly to the Danes, forcing Ethelred into exile in Normandy in the court of his brother-in-law. Before Sven could crown himself king, he died in early 1014, wherein his supporters swore allegiance to his 19-year-old son Canute. The South, still nominally loyal to the House of Wessex, were even more wary to accept Canute as they were Sven. Seeing this opportunity, Ethelred returned from Normandy and launched an offensive against Canute and his supporters. Canute only had major support from the north, so he abandoned England for the time being, vowing to return to assert his claim. Ethelred exacted brutal revenge on the north for defying him, yet another bad move as it only emboldened the north to long for Scandinavian rule, yet again. 2 years later, in 1016, Canute returned to England and proceeded to begin conquering it yet again. Ethelred's eldest son, Ithelstan, had died in 1014 at the hands of Canute's forces, so 26-year-old Edmund was now charged to defend England from the aspirations of the House of Denmark. Ethelred soon died, and Edmund was proclaimed king of what was left of the Wessex-controlled England. King Canute of Denmark proceeded to conquer the rest of England, but was impressed with Edmund's valor in battle and offered the Earldom of Wessex to him, while the House of Denmark would control the rest of the country. Before he could fully agree to this, King Edmund died after reigning less than 8 months. Edmund left behind 2 sons born of his wife Ealdgyth, Edmund and Edward, who were both under the age of 2. To make sure there would be no rivals to his throne, the newly crowned King Canute sent the 2 baby infants to the Swedish court to be secretly executed. Edmund's younger brother was killed by Canute in 1017. The only other contestant from the House of Wessex would be Ethelred's youngest sons from his second marriage to Queen Emma, 13-year-old Edward and 11-year-old Alfred, who were hiding in Normandy at the court of their maternal uncle the Duke. It seemed that Denmark had finally achieved what it had been attempting for 2 centuries, a full conquest of England. The King of Denmark was now King of England in his own right. Indeed, he was the first King of England to style himself as such, not of the English, perhaps because he was not English. Back in 1014, when his father Sven Forkbeard was conquering England, he married Elfgifu, the daughter of a Mercian earl who supported the Danish invasion. This union led to the birth of 2 sons, Sven and Harold, in 1014 and 1016 respectively, all seeing well for the proliferation of the House of Denmark in England. To bolster his dynastic ambitions further, Canute put aside his existing wife Elfgifu to marry a new wife, Emma of Normandy. Yes, the widow of King Ethelred. She was only 32, and this would solidify his claim to England further and allowed for safety against any potential attempts by Emma's 2 sons living in Normandy to revive any claim to the throne. This marriage produced yet another son in 1018, Harthacanute. Now that he was successful in all his conquests, it was time to rebuild the nation he just subdued. He reinstated the laws of King Edgar, much to the joy of the Anglo-Saxons, and seemed to do a better job at appeasing the native English than many of the less than respectable rulers of the House of Wessex. He was regarded as wise and prudent, and he treated the church with respect, as Scandinavia was in the slow but sure process of Christianization. Despite the fact that he had 2 wives, he was considered highly pious and even journeyed on a pilgrimage to Rome. Clearly, Canute was succeeding at softening his image after his brutal conquest and plundering of a sovereign kingdom's throne. In 1028, he did the same act again by successfully claiming a fellow Scandinavian nation, the Kingdom of Norway. He gave the de facto rule of Norway to his son Sven and his wife Elfgifu in Norway. King Canute now controlled a North Sea empire, which included England, Denmark, and Norway. He had made a good impression on the continent as well. The future for Canute's lineage seemed bright to say the least, but of course, as was the case with English history up to this point, it was not to last. King Canute died in 1035 at the age of 40, and the question of who would inherit his realms was raised. Norway had chased Canute's eldest son Sven back to Denmark that same year, where he died shortly thereafter, replacing him with Magnus I, a native Norwegian candidate. So now the division of Canute's domains would be between Denmark and England, with 19-year-old Harold and 17-year-old Harthacanute being the potential heirs. Would one man inherit both realms? Harthacanute was declared the King of Denmark, ruling there as Canute III, wherein he would reassert the Danish claim to Norway. Harold, Canute's son from his first marriage, asserted his claim to England, but this was disputed due to the fact that he was from the first wife that Canute had set aside. Harthacanute intended to also claim England, deriving his complete legitimacy from his mother Emma of Normandy, who was once Queen Consort of England and the final wife of Canute. But the many leading nobles in the north of England seemed to favor Harold. The south, however, wished to await the arrival of Harthacanute from Denmark. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, was the dominant southern voice that supported Harthacanute's claim. Godwin had been placed in his position by Canute and believed that Canute intended Harthacanute to inherit all his lands. Harold controlled the north of England and was successful at exiling Harthacanute's mother Emma of Normandy to the continent to avoid any morale building around her son. Angered by this, Harthacanute vowed to avenge his mother's banishment, but he wasn't able to launch a full-scale invasion yet, as Godwin had been subdued in the south by Harold's forces. Indeed, the Earl of Wessex was now loyal to the King Harold, which definitely disappointed Emma. This turn of events would spill over in 1036, when Emma's 2 elder sons that she had with King Ethelred, Edward and Alfred, now 35 and 33 years old respectively, arrived in England with a show of arms. They were supported by the leading nobles of Normandy, who at the time were also supporting the newly crowned Duke William II of Normandy, who was only 8 years old and dealing with several contestants to his ascension to the throne due to his bastard status. William was the illegitimate son of Edward and Alfred's maternal cousin, Duke Robert I of Normandy, and was fighting for survival against the Dukes of Brittany and Burgundy, who also claimed the duchy. With Normandy in chaos, Edward and Alfred now set their sights to reclaim England for the House of Wessex and drive out the Danish once and for all. Their mother Emma may have been behind their arrival, disappointed that her son Harthacnut was unable to come to England and defeat King Harold. Edward conducted a successful raid at Southampton, and Alfred sneaked into the country to try to see his mother, who at the time was hiding in Winchester, the nominal capital of England, but a city which was definitely more loyal to Emma than Harold. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who already switched sides against Emma, captured Alfred and delivered him to Harold, where he died en route. Emma was understandably furious with these proceedings, but Godwin had risen to be a powerful landlord in the south of England, and she couldn't do much about it, especially since she was practically under the house arrest of King Harold. However, King Harold suddenly died in 1040 with no heirs, just before his half-brother Harthacnut was about to invade and take the throne for himself. Harthacnut was horrified by the death of his older brother Alfred and wanted to exact revenge on behalf of his mother. Once he arrived in England, he dug up Harold's body and beheaded it in order to give it a dishonorable death. He also proceeded to throw the body into the Thames River. Once Harthacnut officially became king, he restored his mother Emma to have an important role in society and wished to prosecute Godwin, who had murdered his half-brother Alfred. The Earl of Wessex was able to escape punishment by offering the new king a richly decorated ship, showing that Godwin was able to use his wealth to generate a certain degree of political power for himself. Harthacnut was used to ruling absolutely in Denmark, so he tried to limit the power of the earls as much as possible. He doubled the size of the English navy, but this was at the cost of the royal treasury, plunging the country into a sizable financial crisis. Harthacnut would only reign for 2 years, when in 1042 he died at the age of 24 via ingesting too much alcohol at a wedding party. He never married, but he likely considered his maternal half-brother Edward of the House of Wessex to be his heir in England, particularly due to his closer relationship with his mother. In his feuds with Magnus I of Norway, they had signed a truce in which they would agree to be each other's heirs depending on who died first. This gave Magnus control of Denmark, but he would also claim that this meant he would inherit all of Harthacnut's domains, including England. However, the nobles of England thought that Edward was a better choice for a successor, not only because he was the son of a previous Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred, but also that he was a half-brother to Harthacnut, while Magnus was a Norwegian with no real connection to either the English or the Danes. Edward also had the advantage of marrying the powerful Earl Godwin's daughter Edith, who had restored relations with Emma by the time of Harthacnut's death. Edward officially ascended to the throne thereafter and was crowned in early 1043. At last, the House of Wessex was once again ruling England, the first time since 1016, but trouble was once again on the horizon. King Edward now faced several challenges. He had to clean up the mess left behind from 3 decades of Danish rule. The leading earls were all either Danish themselves or connected there, with Godwin being married to the sister of Canut's brother-in-law. Godwin continued to control most of southern England, appointing his eldest sons Sven and Harold to several smaller positions within his lands. Edward would have to capitulate to his wife's family's continued political influence, as the House of Godwin had more estates than that of Wessex. King Edward was a weak ruler due to this, and King Magnus of Norway, smelling blood in the water, attempted to invade England in 1046. But Edward was able to repel this invasion at Sandwich in Kent. Edward was still king, but was only just holding on to his crown. He resented his wife's family greatly, but needed them to ensure that the country remained stable. However, he would try to contain the political influence of the House of Godwin as best he could. In 1051, the clergy elected a relative of Godwin to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Edward rejected this election and elected a Norman ally, Robert of Jumieges, instead. Robert would prove to be a successful weapon that Edward could use against Godwin. During a minor conflict that involved Godwin, the new archbishop accused the Earl of Wessex of plotting to murder the king, using the memory of Edward's brother Alfred as a propaganda tool. Godwin's 2 eldest sons, Sven and Harold, attempted to raise armies, but none were particularly willing to fight for them. Because of this, Godwin and his sons were forced to split up, fleeing to both Ireland and Flanders. It was now hopeful that Edward and his allies would have seen the end of the Godwins in England. Edward even put away his Godwin wife Ida into a nunnery, blaming her for the lack of children she was producing. The eldest of the exiled Godwin sons, Sven, went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, only to die on his return in 1052. That same year, Godwin and his other sons were raising further armies and launched a two-front invasion of England. Archbishop Robert and the other Norman allies of Edward feared the retribution of Godwin and fled back to the continent, leaving the king without much support. Edward was effectively imprisoned by the Godwin clan. Stigand, a closer ally to the Godwins, was appointed the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and Edith's regal status was restored. Despite the setback, Edward was able to continue to check the further growth of his wife's family. Godwin the Elder finally died in 1053, leaving the earldom to his eldest son, Harold. Edward was at first able to prevent Harold's brothers from gobbling up more earldoms until 1055, when Tostig Godwinson took over Northumbria, and Gurth Godwinson gained East Anglia in 1057. Now Edward was surrounded by his in-laws from west, north, and east. To deal with this encirclement, the king began to withdraw from domestic policies and focused on intervening in dynastic struggles in neighboring Wales and Scotland. Of the many difficulties of King Edward's reign, the largest was the question of succession. Edith was not bearing any children to Edward, a fact that made later historians believe that Edward had taken a vow set of celibacy, thus cementing his reputation as a pious king. He had no living male relatives of the House of Wessex, and he made little to no effort to find a suitable heir. That changed in 1054 when he found some startling news. Edward had a living nephew, the son of his elder half-brother, King Edmund, known posthumously as Edmund Ironside. Edward the Exile was presumed to have been murdered in Sweden by the orders of Kuth, but he and his elder brother Edmund had escaped and fled to Hungary. Edmund had died at some point during the exile, but Edward the Exile had married and fathered one son and two daughters. This was thrilling news for King Edward. Now he could name a potential heir within his house and not have to worry about any foreign dynasties having designs on a vacant throne. He recalled his nephew and his family to England, but due to the King of Hungary being difficult in the exchange, it took 3 years for this to come to fruition. Once the exile landed on England with his family, his death would soon follow, leaving his 6-year-old son, Edgar, as the new potential heir to King Edward. However, with the relative lack of support that boys of his age received as being the potential heir to a throne, and the overall perception throughout Europe that King Edward did not have an heir and the crown was ripe for taking, Edgar was in no practical position to assert his claim, as he and his elder sister Margaret were on their own, with the great-uncle the king seeming to lose interest in that lineage upon the death of their father. With the lack of a familial heir established, 4 main candidates were desiring to be King Edward's successor upon his death. Harold Godwinson, the ambitious Earl of Essex, who was both Edward's brother-in-law and had connections across the whole country. Sven II of Denmark, who planned to reassert the old Danish claim to England that had existed since the early 9th century. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway and son of Magnus I, who claimed that Harthacnut had promised both England and Denmark to him upon his childless death. And finally, Duke William II of Normandy, Edward's first cousin once removed and chief ally against the Godwin clan. It is quite possible that Edward himself preferred the claim of William, but historians are unsure of the degree to which he made the Normans aware of this. One pivotal event in the context of secession occurred around 1064. Harold Godwinson became shipwrecked at the county of Poitou in northeastern France, where he was captured by the local count. William II of Normandy demanded that the Count of Poitou hand over Harold to him, which he did. Harold was now a prisoner of William, which was perhaps an ideal situation for King Edward of England, as an ally of his had captured arguably his greatest political adversary. During this captivity, Harold helped William fight off an invasion from the Duke of Brittany into Normandy, and he earned the respect of leading Norman nobles. Duke William knighted Harold and presented him several arms and honors, but agreed only to release Harold if he swore to support William to become the next King of England upon the death of Edward. Harold agreed, and was then released and returned safely to England. Another key event occurred hereafter. In 1065, the citizens of Northumbria, a great majority of which were Danes, revolted against their Earl, Tostig Godwinson. The treacherous Harold, who wanted to gain even more control of England, supported this rebellion against his younger brother, which created a rift in the House of Godwin that Edward was hoping to exploit. Of his 2 brother-in-laws, the king supported Tostig's supremacy in Northumbria, but Harold was able to fan the fuel of rebellion enough to drive Tostig out of England, into the arms of King Harold Hardrada of Norway, who gave him asylum. Harold Godwinson now controlled Northumbria, and was now looking more and more of a plausible successor to the entire kingdom in the eyes of many. It seemed that the aging Edward had little to no choice but to name the ever-popular Harold as his heir, but before he could do so, he slipped into a coma at the end of the year. According to certain scholars, Edward regained consciousness briefly in early 1066, informing Harold and his wife that he wished them both to rule England together on his death, but this event is dubious at best. King Edward finally died on January 5, 1066, at the age of 62. This, predictably, plunged England into chaos yet again. Godwinson wasted no time. He immediately crowned himself as King of England after the leading noblemen had elected him. However, Harold had previously made an oath to support William, the Duke of Normandy, to be the next king, but with the support of most of the people of England, Harold seemed to be unstoppable and didn't wish to honor an oath he made under duress. This angered William, claiming that any oath made superseded any later change of mind of a dying king, and he immediately began plans to invade England to assert his claim to the throne. The Duke of Normandy had the support of the Church in Rome, as well as the King of France. Harold knew that William was planning an invasion, so he mounted several troops along the Isle of Wight in September of that year. Around that time, Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, officially asserted his claim to the English crown, having solidified an army of his own with the help of the defected Tostig Godwinson. Hardrada and Tostig invaded northern England with 700 ships. King Harold rushed up into Yorkshire and surprised the Norwegian army, winning the decisive Battle of Stamford Bridge. This battle resulted in the death of both Harold Hardrada and Tostig, which extinguished the Norwegian threat. Meanwhile, the Normans were invading the south of England at the time, with little to no opposition as Harold was busy in the north. Duke William marched unopposed in Wessex, only to meet up with Harold's forces on October 14, 1066 in Hastings, Sussex. The famous Battle of Hastings then ensued, which was mostly an evenly matched affair until Harold Godwinson was killed in battle. According to an interpretation of the Bayeux Tapestry, which depicted several events leading up to the battle, Harold was killed with an arrow to the eye. William ordered Harold's body to be thrown into the sea. William now had to consolidate his power in England, as the people were not about to accept this foreign ruler from the continent to be their king. The English clergy had nominated the teenage Edgar, King Edward's great-nephew, as king. However, these were the same people who had passed over this superior claim to the throne to support Harold Godwinson, so this was considered an illegitimate practice. William was then able to invade London and most of Kent unopposed, as he and his retainers burned down any town that opposed him. He moved the royal treasury from Winchester to London, thus moving the English capital for the first time. He was able to ensure the submittance of leading southern nobles, including Edgar, to his claim. He was coronated on Christmas Day in 1066 in London, in which he began to reconstruct a palace that would later become the Tower of London. William was the first king of England from the House of Normandy, gaining this right by conquest. This ended the reign of the House of Wessex once and for all, and a new continual dynastic thread was ready to dominate England. The time of the Wessex kings, interrupted briefly by the House of Denmark and Godwin, was an important time for England as it solidified the concept of England as a nation, uniting the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes into one political identity. It also was undoubtedly a time of great upheaval and carnage, with constant invasions from the Scandinavians, resulting in back-and-forth fortunes for either side. But it could be argued that this was the only time in the entire history of the English monarchy where the monarchs themselves were English, before the Norman conquest introduced an entire alien dynasty to hold the throne. William the Conqueror completely changed the landscape of English society, confiscating all private land and putting it in the hands of Norman aristocrats. The English church would become more aligned with the continent as well, and Anglo-Saxon law would have to wait a while to come back as the more Frankish feudal system would override previous customs. Succession would be more strict now, following a father-son pattern even if that son was an infant. New kings would no longer be formally elected by councils. In the next video, we will examine further the House of Normandy and the effect the conquest had on the transformation of English society as a whole. Well, this concludes the series on the House of Wessex. Obviously, as I said, the next one will be the House of Normandy within the English Monarchy series. I appreciate everybody for watching. This was the first couple of large videos that I've made on this channel here, and I'm hoping to expand and improve as I continue with other examinations into various dynasties. So again, thank you for watching.